Every person's story has something to teach us. How others view life, how obstacles are overcome, how joy is felt, how fears are faced, how love is expressed. The Matters of Faith podcast explores individual stories of people's lives and how faith plays a part. It may not be your story, but it may help shape yours. And now, Matters of Faith with your host, Jay Wilburn.
You have found the Matters of Faith podcast on Project Entertainment Network with your host, Jay Wilburn. This is episode 202. My guest today is going to be Michael Allen Rose, the author of Jurassichrist. We talk about his background, his connections to faith, where his current philosophies lie, and his writing career, among other things. And now we'll get into the rest of the episode. This is the Matters of Faith podcast on Project Entertainment Network. My guest is Michael Allen Rose. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you here. I really enjoyed reading the book. It's not the sort of thing I've read before, so you've come up with something fairly unique, using some familiar ideas and characters and that sort of thing. It's kind of starting from the beginning, since it is a faith podcast. Did you have any sort of connection to faith when you were growing up?
Yeah, I did. I think my journey is probably not uncommon. It's similar to one that a lot of people, I think, have gone on, where I grew up in the church. My parents are Christians. They took me to church and tried to sort of instill that belief system in me, which for a while held pretty fast, as it does with kids, especially, because it's like, what do you believe? You believe what the adults are telling you.
Right. And
as I got older, I started to question more and things, and I sort of went on that fairly common path, I think, from sort of I was a Christian, now I'm a deist.
Okay.
Now I'm an agnostic. And then I started reading like people like Dawkins and people like that going, well, an agnostic is just an atheist without any conviction. And I'm like, well, okay. So I guess I consider myself an atheist at this point, but I don't consider myself somebody who is adamant or militant about my beliefs, because I have a lot of interest in spirituality and religion and theology and philosophy. I think that we suffer by cutting ourselves off from ideas like that. So I try not to be, a militant prick about it, like some people are.
Now, a lot of times the breaking point for people when they're learning to let go of faith comes down to like either the story of Noah doesn't make a lot of sense, or the way that Christians treat people doesn't make a lot of sense. Was it one or the other of those that really sort of became the breaking point for you?
For me, it was the latter. I think that the hypocrisy of people was something that I really noted even when I was a teenager, because I, like a lot of kids who are into like horror and heavy music and weird cartoons and whatever, I was ostracized. I had the tough teenager kind of situation that most of us have, especially those of us who end up going into the arts or in comedy. And I think that hypocrisy was magnified for me because of my experiences in school and in the church population and in the community. I grew up in a fairly conservative part of the country. So I think like I always tried to be a kind person. I always tried to be a thoughtful person. I always tried to be somebody who is empathetic and sees a variety of different viewpoints. And I think that I didn't see that much in the faith communities that I was able to observe. And that disconnect really struck a chord in me. And I was like, well, wait, if they're telling me that I'm a bad person because of all these things I'm interested in, or telling me that I am going to hell because of a certain kind of music I listen to or something like that, yet they're treating people this abominably, there was a major disconnect for me there. And I think that's when I started to go, okay, I don't know that spirituality has to be connected with an organization. Maybe spirituality can be more individual. Maybe I don't have to be a part of a church community. Maybe I can just figure out what I believe by reading, by studying, by talking to people. And I think that was really the jumping off point for me, and probably why I'm still interested in writing about things like religion and spirituality and things like that, even though I generally identify as an atheist.
Now, you had mentioned music and some things like that. I don't know how close we are in age, but in the book, I guess around maybe around the third act, you have a sort of a passing mention of Satanic Panic. Was that a time period where you were growing up in the church and dealing with that?
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's ground zero for those kinds of feelings for a lot of us, I think. And I was young, so I'm technically one of those, I guess they call us exennials, where
Okay.
I'm sort of between Gen X and millennial.
All right.
So I was a little bit young, but certainly affected by the whole Satanic Panic thing. And I kind of joke a lot, but it's joking, but it's true, that what the church was trying to do, and I came from a sort of not hardcore evangelical, but a very sort of evangelically based faith where it's like, what goes into the mind should be pure, and we don't play games with the devil's, pop culture kind of stuff. And I think that some of the books in my church library that were about like the evils of rock music or the evils of D&D or how all these other religions were cults did the opposite thing to me and made me go, this is interesting. Why haven't I, like, this is really fascinating stuff. And so, I would sneak out during the sermon to go to the bathroom or something. And instead of going back to church, I would just head to the church library and look at all these books about like the evils of rock and roll and whatever. And I'm like, but why are they saying this is evil? And at that point, some of these books were so dated that they were talking about stuff that was 10 or 15 years out of date at least. And I'm like, that's evil? Really? Those old guys? So I think it sort of had the opposite effect on me by opening my eyes to all these other interesting things and going, okay, why do they dislike this so much? What are they afraid of, or what are they trying to suppress?
Oh, that's funny. I grew up Southern Baptist, and
Oh,
I believe technically the church we go to is, of course, we haven't been to church since the pandemic started, other than online
sure.
stuff. But the church that we go to, I believe, is still technically affiliated Baptist, but it's one of those. It's not a mega church, but it's one of the ones that has multiple campuses, and like
Oh,
everything's on the
okay.
screen and beamed in and all that kind of stuff. So very, very hip
Sure.
and modern looking and stuff. So there's whole debates on what that is in terms of faith. But I do remember the Bible studies that we did on like the evils of rock music and trying to push kids towards the Christian versions of it and stuff like that. But
Sure.
again, like the stuff was dated, so there's a huge difference between heavy metal, say at the very beginning of the '80s, and then like toward the end. So the whole time I'm watching, I'm like, whoa, I've never heard of that band. I may need to check them out or something.
Yep.
But it was all these older dated bands, that just happened to have terrible things on their album covers or whatever that
Right.
made for good
Right.
slides and stuff. And then of
That
course
sort of
all that
that sort
stuff
of
evolves
performance.
over time with the church. So whatever, eventually
Yeah.
they were upset about Harry Potter, and then they completely forgot about that. And then
Absolutely.
Rowling kind of went through her gyrations with what she's doing now. So like the world kind of won't stay static enough for any of that stuff to hold and make sense and all that.
That's true.
Now, at what point in this process, so your personal journey kind of goes from, being the kid that believes what he's told in a traditional sense, and then going through the spectrum until you identify maybe hard atheist or soft atheist. During that time period, where does writing fall in for you? Was it a part of your life all along, or is it something you discovered along the way?
I think writing's been a part of my life since the beginning, practically. My mom likes to trot out this play I wrote when I was like 5 or 6, and I don't even know where I got the idea of a script format at the time because
Right.
it's not like I was a 6-year-old reading screenplays or anything.
Right.
But I like to say that it was my first foray into absurdism because there's a point at which one of the outlaws, it's a Western, of course, one of the outlaws fires 7 shots at the sheriff from his 6-shooter. That's comedy.
Did you did you address it in the play?
No, I
Okay.
had no idea it was funny at the time.
Okay. I guess diving into your work there, that sort of meta, that meta storytelling is a part of Jurassichrist. which is the book that I just read that we're going to be talking about a little bit. Looking at influences, of course, you have in your bio, you've written some Bizarro and stuff like that. How would you? Of course, people have tackled this for years, but how would you describe Bizarro as a genre?
I think it's something different to everyone who considers themselves a practitioner of it. But to me, it's the genre of the genreless. It's a label where you can sort of play with tropes and you don't have to necessarily follow them. When it was founded, it was basically a bunch of people on the internet finding each other and going, "Oh, I write stuff that's not quite classifiable under traditional genre labels either." And there are enough of us where we're going, "Oh, we all like this. So why don't we just call it a thing? Because obviously we all want to read it." And for me, it was like, well, sometimes the horror community looks at stuff and goes, "Well, this is too funny for horror," or the fantasy people will go, "Oh, this doesn't follow the sword and sorcery thing that I'm used to," or sci-fi people might be like, "This doesn't have enough spaceships," Whereas in Bizarro, it builds its own reality. It's concerned with its own internal logic, so you can do things like, I have a planet full of people that are pancakes.
Yeah.
But that's not what the story is about. It's just the consensual reality that we accept. It's all about suspending your disbelief and going along for the ride instead of picking things apart and going, well, that's not realistic. And I think one of the things that appeals to me about Bizarro is, like surrealism and absurdism, it's not concerned about what's possible in the reality we live in. It's concerned about an alternate reality next door where we get to construct the tropes ourselves, where we get to go, "Oh, this is the rule of this reality, and if you go there with me as a reader,
Right,
you're going to have a good time."
I didn't see the label Bizarro anywhere on Jurassichrist. Would you consider it in that category, or if not, how close to it do you think it is?
I would say it's in that category.
Okay.
And like I said, I feel like Bizarro is a genre, but it's not necessarily one of those genres that has to stand by itself. You can combine it with almost any other genre. There have been Bizarro westerns, Bizarro romance novels, lots of Bizarro horror. Some people do that kind of grindhousey, schlocky thing. Some people do more like classic absurdism and existentialism. I like to do comedy, and I like to write stories that are funny and just out there, and it fits in that sort of Bizarro umbrella, I think, because I've written everything from noir to like serious political stuff to horror, and I think the only thing that ties it all together is it's weird and it's unconcerned with traditional tropes.
That's funny because in Jurassichrist, of course, you deal with some high philosophical concepts, but then you'll still go with some of the lowbrow humor at times as you're going through. Now, as I read through, and of course, I guess compared to many people of faith, I've had a little wider influence, and I'm writing some extreme horror, and other things don't quite match up
Sure.
to my faith philosophy, I suppose. But when I read through, and I've read through a number of either extreme horror or Bizarro books where Jesus in some way plays a character, and of course in many of them there is a tone of like I don't know if disrespect is the right word, but a hard lean into sacrilege, I guess you'd say.
Sure. Or irreverence, maybe.
Right, maybe. But again, I think irreverence is kind of softer. Now,
Sure.
with your book, I do think the irreverence is there, but I think it's purposeful. And when I read it, I don't read it as this is meant as a slam or this is meant to upset Christians. Now, I'm sure plenty would be upset if they read through it, but there are some people that are upset by just about anything. But doing an objective read of your book, I didn't read an intention in there to be upsetting or to well, of course, ideas and faith are challenged in it, but I didn't feel the sense of like a finger in the eye sort of challenge, I guess you'd say.
Sure.
Was there a parameter to you when you were dealing with, okay, I'm going to make Jesus a character. There's going to be some irreverence here, but maybe my goal is not just to get a rise out of somebody.
I would say that's definitely the case. You know, I've always kind of felt that shock is easy. I mean, and I know some people are going to balk at that or bristle at that, but I feel like shock is easy in the same way that you could go into a dinner party and crap on the dining table next to the punch bowl and it would shock people, but that's all it does.
Right.
And I felt like it's very easy to irritate people that believe in something by taking the piss out of the thing that they believe in. But it doesn't do much more than that. And
right.
I would like to think, I hope, that all of my books, to some degree or another, have more going on underneath the surface than just a shocking image or an irreverent tone. Like I said, I'm really interested in theology and philosophy and sort of higher-minded pursuits, and I want to explore those ideas, through maybe a bizarre lens. So I think, I don't set out just to piss people off.
Right.
I may challenge a lot of beliefs, and I think most of my stuff does that in some way. But I mean, like my parents, I love them to death. I have a great relationship with my parents. They're still Christians. I don't always tell them to read my stuff, but I feel like I'm not that teenager anymore that's like railing against things just to like rebel. I'm
right.
like, no, I like to think that there's a deeper thought process involved and that I can go, okay, I'm trying to explore the idea of, what it means to be adherent to one specific faith and not question it. Like, I think that's part of Jurassichrist. Or what is it to live in a totalitarian state or a police state? Like, I have a noir novel called Embry, Hard Boiled, that's about a chicken detective in a world of eggs. And it's a ridiculous concept on its surface, but it really becomes about like classism and sort of the ghettoization of certain people. Like the chicken folk are looked down at by the egg folk, and it becomes this whole class structure thing. So I think the fun of Bizarro for me is sneaking in some really smart and thoughtful ideas underneath a veneer of like shock or craziness or can you believe this exists kind of feelings.
I read a lot of books, and especially with interviews, one of the things I ask for, from the publisher, whoever broaches the subject, is go ahead and send me the book we're going to be talking about, and I'll try to get through it. Sometimes that's a 2 or 3 day turnaround. Mm-hmm. So in addition to my pleasure reading and other reading I'm doing for other projects, I'll usually try to speed through these books, not skim them, but read them quicker than I would for pleasure.
Sure.
And I was trying to do that with Jurassichrist, but I kept slowing down as I was reading because there's a real finesse to the storytelling, and it didn't ever reach a point of drone where I'm like, okay, I can run through this section and then get to the next. I'd start to do that, and I'd be like, okay, whoa, something's happening, so I need to pay attention.
Great.
Need to pay attention to what's going on here.
Yeah.
And looking through, and I'm going to try to be as careful as I can, not to talk about it in detail, but not spoil.
Sure.
It never went the way I've expected, as much as you'd expect something like this to go, because you get into sort of, I guess, what you'd call the first act, and you're like, okay, the second coming didn't go as planned, so now he's going to be stuck here, and that's how it's going to end. And it was like, oh, okay, wait. You get into the second act, okay, now we're backing up to see who the real villain is. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. Okay, third act, we're going down. All right, that didn't end up how I expected. Okay, now we're somewhere else, and then fourth act, it kind of opens up to this pantheon of more higher characters, I suppose, and then the whole nature of the universe is in question and that sort of thing. So looking through that structure within the absurdism, and you pretty much could have gone any direction you wanted with a story of this nature. Did you have it planned out that that's the way it was going to go from the time you started writing, or were you discovering it as you went?
I'm I guess what I forget what the kids call it these days, but I guess a plantser, where I plan some and plan some of it. Part of it's by the seat of my pants. I think the discovery process for me is always really rewarding because I half the time I have a really bare bones structure, but I don't really know how I'm going to get from beat to beat. And part of the fun of that is sometimes my characters will do something that surprises me, where it's like, this is the thing that needs to happen now, as I'm looking at the book. So I take a long time with first drafts, and I don't have
Hmm.
a lot of revisions, honestly, usually, because I usually end up with a pretty clean first draft that has the bulk of the story there. So
Right.
usually my second draft or so is the one I send to publishers to see if they're interested. There's not much more revision than that, other than when I work with an editor and get things back. And I think that's because I allow myself time to sort of discover what might happen and let the story go where it wants to go without trying to control it too hard.
Okay.
So, like in this case, I had the general idea and the pitch of sort of how the narrative would unfold, but there are lots and lots of details in this that I didn't know were going to happen before I got into the story and went, oh, this needs to happen now, or I would just surprise myself by seeing what would happen if this was the next thing that they had to deal with. So half of the fun is for me is just that discovery process.
Any sci-fi novel kind of, especially if you're dealing with processes, will have some science babble in it.
Hmm.
And I guess there's a science to heaven in this, in the sense that, like,
Sure.
okay, if you're traveling between planes, this is how it works, and of course much of it is absurd, but it doesn't feel like it's just thrown out there. It feels like either you had to plan out, okay, this is the absurd process by which these rules work,
Hmm.
or it feels like you had to go back in the editing and tweak it to make absurd sense, I guess you'd say. I'm trying to be careful again because I don't want to give
Sure.
away the best parts of it.
Yeah.
But it felt like you had in your version of sort of a bureaucratic pseudoscience heaven,
Mhm.
that deals transdimensionally and apart from time. You had an internal logic
Mhm.
and a complex system of pseudoscience that sort of explained everything and then allowed in all the other pieces too. Did that just fall out on the page, or was there some work in making that what it appeared when I got it?
I think I think it's a combination of the two because I had some idea of what it might look like, and then some of it just came from the natural, like what is the funniest thing that can happen here. And especially when we start to open, and I don't think this is in spoiler territory, but when we start to open it up to realize that all the theological possibilities are at least partially true,
Okay, yeah,
um, I think that that's when it really starts to go, okay, that's when the organization starts to sort of become necessary. But my brain tends to put things into categories and systems anyway. So it wasn't hard to sort of figure out what that internal logic might be for me. I just kind of went, okay, well, this is obviously the way the planes work, and this is how you get from one to the other, and this is the structure, especially like the bureaucratic structure of this particular version of heaven or whatever. It all kind of just made sense to me, as nonsensical as that might be.
I haven't read Bizarro as widely as a lot of people have, but I've probably read it more widely than, say, the general population.
Sure.
One thing that I see come up, not all the time, but enough to where it jumped out at me when we were reading here, is this category of culture called as seen on TV.
Ah,
And for a
yes.
lot of people, it's just a shelf in the store. It's just nostalgia from late night '80s or whatever.
Hmm.
It feels like for the absurdist or bizarro writer that there's something bigger there that maybe resonates with them, and then it becomes a tool, I guess, in the way that a zombie can be a tool for a horror writer to sort of
Hmm.
reflect society however they want. This sort of like broad, strange, as seen on TV category seems to resonate with bizarro writers and readers in a way that represents something much bigger and maybe even much more sinister about society than most people derive from what that phrase brings up. I guess broadly, what is that? If you could define it for me, and then what was it for you? I guess in this particular story.
You make a really interesting point in that, like, zombies are used often as a tool by a horror writer, and the generally accepted sort of metaphor there is like consumerism, like mindless consumerism, or the crowd mentality. So I think it's used similarly. I think that especially, again, people of my generation have an obsession with that sort of late night infomercial thing. And I remember the TV being absolutely inundated with ads when I was a kid about all these things you could order away for and pay COD, send no money now,
Right.
And it was like such blatant on its face consumerism, like just thrust into your face. And I also grew up in, I was watching cartoons and cereal commercials and stuff every Saturday morning in the 80s and into the 90s. Like our entire generation was obsessively sold to all the time. And as seen on TV, I think represents to us that sort of the ludicrous degree to which commercialism had infested everything in our lives. Like it's this whole line of products that you don't actually need. They manufacture problems and then tell you that they've created the solution. I was talking to my publisher about this actually on a podcast not long ago, and said, that's the thing about infomercials is they create problems that nobody has. Like you'll see someone in a commercial opening a cereal box and the cereal will fly everywhere and the bowl will go flying and hit the dog and the spoon will like fly up into the ceiling and stick into the stucco. You're like, that's never happened to anybody. But according to the infomercial, you need this fancy lid that you can put on your cereal bowl that covers half of it so you don't, like, your cereal doesn't explode in the kitchen. I'm like, that's not a problem anyone's ever had. But this hyper consumerism has forced them to go, well, we're going to make up a problem so we can sell more crap. So I think that's part of it. Is it's just like we grew up so blasted over and over again by consumerism, and the inflation rate has so outpaced the wage rate, and we're just financially, Gen Y and below are in such dire straits these days. And it's like we see that looking back as this weird cancer on our generation, and I think as seen on TV is just a really kind of funny, kind of sad manifestation of it. So I think it's really easy to use it as a tool and going, this is this hyper consumerism taken to a ridiculous degree, like these amazing products that nobody needs, that fulfill no actual need. I think that's what it was for me. I remember going to the Mall of America when I was a kid and seeing an As Seen on TV store, which actually negates the whole point of As Seen on TV, because you're supposed to order it from the TV, but now you can just go to the mall and order the product that you saw on TV, but you can get it in the store. It's just this tangled web of consumerism, and it makes a very easy tool for villainy, I think.
It plays into a bigger theme of evolution, where the sort of the powers that be above the world are toying with evolution, and it seems that there's some evil force behind it too, toying around. And in addition to the evolution of the actual creatures, the mammals and the dinosaurs, you have sort of the evolution of morality going forward. And I don't know that it spoils much. In the book, the dinosaurs have a particular morality, and the mammals can't seem to get away from a more scatological morality and sense of community and all that doesn't cast us in the best light going forward.
You noticed that, huh?
Yeah. What was sort of your idea going into this book about tackling morality?
I think there's a weird sort of combination, I think, of optimism and cynicism, in that I've always sort of liked to expect that people won't do the right thing, but hope that they will.
Okay.
Prepare for the worst and hope for the best, right? And I think I feel that way about humanity in general. And part of that comes from, again, my early life understanding of people's hypocrisy and sort of how abominably they treated each other. And yet they preach these sort of moral lessons and how to be a good person. I'm like, yeah, but you're not practicing what you preach, right? I mean, that's a cliche for a reason. So I think going into this, I knew right away that humans, or at least the predecessors to humans, whatever the forces of the universe set into motion to become us, wouldn't be very morally evolved, in the way that I don't necessarily think we're particularly morally evolved. I think a lot of people use faith as an excuse for their moral behavior sometimes, and I think that takes a lot of the responsibility away from us, and that's not good. Even when I was still a believer, I always thought, well, if we get into the free will question, I know, but it's like if we are believing in a force out there, a loving God, or a force that has agency and interest in our lives, and it gave us the choice to act morally or immorally, why do so many people act immorally? Well, it's easier. It's easier to be selfish. And I think it doesn't take much to push people to that, because you give them something that they feel will give them personal power, or or personal gain, they're going to go on the easy path. So I thought, I guess when I was making this story, that it's like, well, the mammals, I know how we ended up because I'm living in it, and I don't think that it would be difficult to push them into an even worse version of ourselves. And then when I was contrasting that with what we look at as the dinosaurs, right? When we think of them, well, they're savage, brainless animals.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of this lesser thing. Well, what if they had it right? What if they were more societally oriented? What if they were more invested in the golden rule? What if they were more interested in the collective than the individual? And how that upends our view of humans being the center of the universe as far as morality and consciousness are concerned. So I guess it's an idea of upending that. And I've always appreciated, like, I used to be really interested in Copernicus and Galileo, because it wasn't so much the science that the church objected to as it was the idea that humans are not the center of the universe and are not the most important thing in God's creation. Like, that blew their minds, and like, it shouldn't. Right. Because we shouldn't have that strong an opinion of ourselves.
Right.
So I guess sort of it was like, I'm going to take the piss out of humanity a little bit here too, because that's an important thing, I think, to state.
Looking at the problems with morality in humanity, do you just see it as a broad human nature problem, or do you see something that's more pronounced when you add faith on top of that?
I think it's a human nature problem that faith has attempted to solve, and maybe for some people has, but for some people definitely has not. And I think that the idea of an external judge of morality maybe helps people act right, but I don't know that that's a real... It feels disingenuous. It doesn't feel like a good reason to act right. I don't know whether there is an afterlife or something beyond this world. What I do know is that I have a limited time in this world. And while I'm in it, I want to be kind. I want to treat others as I'd like to be treated. And I want to make this the best possible life for myself and for the people I care about. So I guess it's humanism, really. That's where I kind of landed, I think, in my faith journey, is I don't have a lot of faith in people, but I believe them to be, I believe them to have the potential to be better. It's very aspirational, I guess.
In the story, you explore the idea of different timelines. If evolution took a different course, if different deities behaved in different ways, and that kind of thing. So one possibility, of course, is that human beings get separated from religion. So there's no longer the supernatural overseer going on there. Within the story, and then I guess just in life in general, do you see that as an ideal? Like, if you could separate humanity from religious beliefs, do you think that would create closer to an ideal that you are looking for?
I don't know that I would say that separating humanity from faith entirely would help. But I think that removing people from the sort of the dogma, the unthinking, unblinking structure of a lot of faith-based organizations would probably help. I think that people get very, very invested in the human created parts of faith. You know, they get invested in their organizations and in their communities, and community is an important thing. But I think that just like in the book, collectively, we do stupid things. Collectively, we can sway people's opinions in a bad way. And I think that maybe more of an emphasis on individual faith and freedom in spirituality would be better than putting all our chips on religious organizations.
Mm-hmm.
If that answers your question, I guess I think there's something to that. So I don't know that it's separating people from their faith would be good. It's more that giving people more options and a wider spectrum of understanding about what faith and spirituality can be might be better for us as a species.
How possible do you think that is, in the sense that, like, if you go back to the founders of the church, I guess you'd say, once you get past the time period that would have been the stories of Jesus, and then you get to historic figures that are a little easier to place in time and figure out exactly what they did. And sort of the aspirations of the early church was sort of this denominationless whole that didn't play out over time.
Right.
And then even if you get to the history of America, you have the founding fathers who aspired to like a partyless democracy or semi-democracy. They didn't really trust people as much as maybe you do, I think. But this idea that, okay, we won't need political parties and this will work out. And then, of course, that lasted for like one election, and then we were on the road to where we are now, where in some cases political party serves as a substitute or a supplement to religious faith in some cases as they identify. So is there a possibility to reach that point, or are we always going to form a party, form a religion, form a cult if enough of us get together and start talking about the same things?
You know, I'm afraid that we're sort of doomed to that path, and I think that a lot of the best possibilities exist in just trying to sort of take care of the people we can. Because I don't think as a species, I don't think we're going to end up too far from the mammals in my book. I think that, we consider religion to be one thing, but it can be also things like consumerism or political party. We treat those as religions in a lot of ways. We see that with like big cults of personality, especially with politicians and things where there's obvious evidence that people stop thinking for themselves and literally just believe the dogma that's coming out of the leader's mouth. It's just like a cult, which is essentially just another type of organization that's a religion. So I think we'll always tend to gravitate toward someone who thinks they have the answers, because I think we're scared of mystery as a human race. I think we want answers because it makes us feel better about this mystery that we're living through. So I think we'll always gravitate to those things, but I guess I would like to do whatever small part I can to help people realize that coming to an individual understanding of those things isn't so scary. That thinking outside of the box and maybe, looking at the texts or thinking about the nature of the universe yourself isn't scary, and you can explore it without a guide leading the way all the time.
I found it fun when I was reading the book when you brought the Jesus character in, because you're seeing sort of the things that he conjures and the choices he makes, and how he tries to survive in the beginning, and then how he adapts as the story goes on, and the arc of the character and all that. But one of the most fun things about it that I really appreciated just from a writing standpoint was how you decided which of his powers and in what way they manifest. So it seemed like you actually took, okay, here are all the miracles Jesus perform. So how does that power look in an adventure story? So,
Absolutely.
can he fly? Can he make things come out of nothing? Can he change things? So all the things you did. What sort of went into that process of, I guess, almost creating Jesus as sort of a superhero character, where okay, here are his powers and here are his weaknesses, and here's where the limits are, and here's where that can be manipulated. Did you kind of chart it out and say, okay, I'm going to use these, and maybe these miracles don't quite fit into my story?
I think it was more, knowing, again, having grown up in the church, having some religious education, I just sort of, as our hero comes up against obstacles, just like in any adventure story, he thinks about what resources he has at his disposal. And in this case, essentially, I had a real life superhero to play with. I mean, I thought about different Bible stories that I remembered. I'm like, well, what did he do here? Okay, here's the transubstantiation story or whatever. And it's like, well, what can he do? He can make things into other things. He at one point he ascended to heaven. Okay, he can ascend. He can fly. He can, there are all these different things that have analogs in the Bible. So that was part of it, and I was just having fun with creating, I guess, creative uses of those different like miracles and stories about Jesus. And then my girlfriend, who is often my alpha reader, when I'm writing a manuscript, she went to Catholic school but grew up Lutheran, so she sort of had both sides of that particular side of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And she went through a lot of the I guess the religious education stuff that I either avoided or didn't really pay attention to. So after I was done, she actually took a pass at it, as she usually does anyway with my work. But she called back all of that religious training and went, you say this here. Do you remember when he talked to he made the donkey talk or whatever? I'm like, what's going on? And she'd call up these stories and things that I didn't remember or really have a context for. She'd be like, well, he could do this because in the Bible at this point he does this. I'm like, that's perfect. So essentially I had a sort of religion editor in-house working with me on making sure that the character was sort of authentic to at least an analog to things that he did,
right,
in our Bibles.
You get finished with a book like this, and it's like, all right, now I'm going to publish it. Now, of course, the safest route is always to self-publish because there's no gatekeepers, and it really doesn't matter what you write. But then you take a book like Jurassichrist, and you're like, all right, who wants to put this out into the world? So what was that process like? Did you kind of say, okay, well, I got to eliminate 90% of these publishers because they're going to not know what to do with it or not want it, and then who among these are going to be the ones to want it? So did you already have a publisher in mind or someone who was already interested, or did you kind of go hunting for a person that would be interested in Jurassichrist?
Well, I came into publishing kind of backwards. I started in that I started in the small press arena, which is where I entered. I was never one of those, like, I'm going to put together a manuscript and try to find agents and try to be a big writer. I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that now. I'd like to write something that I would be able to pitch to agents and find some representation and all that. But when I started, I hit the ground running with Eraserhead Press, which is, one of the godfathers of Bizarro.
Mm-hmm.
I met the guys from various other micro presses. I've worked with Rooster Republic. I've worked with Bizarro Pulp Fiction and Bizarro Pulp Press and just all these different publishers. Omnium Gatherum out in California. And I've always been sort of publisher agnostic. Like, I like to work with a variety of different people. So in this case, for Perpetual Motion Machine, I met Max and Lori several years ago, and they're just wonderful. And yeah. Lori has done layout for several of my books on other presses.
Me too.
So I knew her from doing that. She's messed around with my stuff before. And I've given her some challenges. Some of my stuff is very metafictional, and I do a lot of stuff with text.
Oh, you're one of those guys.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you get a chance, check out, I have a book called Boiled Americans.
Okay.
That is a bunch of, like, it's everything from shape poetry to autobiography to, it's all about gun violence and living in America in sort of the age of the gun, based on a bunch of shootings that happened in Chicago a few years ago. But that's all kinds of weird text stuff. My horror novel, actually, The Indifference of Heaven, which Omnium Gatherum put out a couple of years ago. That too deals with like all these weird textual things. So I knew that Lori and Max were well equipped to deal with my particular type of nonsense. And Max has always enjoyed my sense of humor, like when I've had conversations with him and stuff. He gets what I want to do. Interestingly, when I first pitched this book, I talked to a couple of the small presses that I already had relationships with, and they either felt like they didn't want to publish anything this year with Jesus, or they didn't want to publish anything this year with dinosaurs. And I was like, okay, all right, fine, fair enough. So I thought about it for a while. I'm like, Perpetual Motion puts out really cool stuff. I think Max gets me, and they'll understand immediately what I want to do with this. And yeah, sure enough, they jumped on it. They read it, and it was absolutely a match. So I'm lucky in that I have a lot of different relationships with small presses now that, if they ask me to write something that kind of fits in what they publish, I might take a crack at that. Mm-hmm. Or if I've got a new manuscript that I'm like, this is bizarre and strange, and who would want this? There's usually between 2 and 3 presses I can think of that are like, maybe they want to look.
How far back does your publishing career go?
My first novella was Party Wolves in My Skull. That was from Eraserhead Press back in 2011.
Okay, so you go back a ways.
That was my first publication as far as an actual publisher looking at my stuff and putting it out there. And that's actually still probably the book with the most reviews. I mean, I know everyone checks out your first book, and then after that, it's like pulling teeth with your friends and family. Come on, read another one. But that's another one where, we talked about the internal logic earlier. And in that book, there's a guy who wakes up in the middle of the night to find that his eyeballs have fallen in love with each other. And they decide that he's keeping them apart. So they basically leave him. They tear themselves out of his skull, steal his car, and take off for parts unknown. And when he wakes up, his eyeballs are missing. They've gone off. They've stolen his car. And in the middle of the night, a pack of wolves has moved in because now he's got a vacancy in his head, in his skull. So he has a bunch of stoned wolves. They're party wolves. They just sit around getting stoned and playing poker. They don't have jobs. So he decides he's going to get his eyeballs back. And he goes on this big, long road trip, and it's just like this zany, madcap sort of Tex Avery cartoon by way of like Kafka or something. And that's another one where it's like the internal logic is sound because it sounds absurd and crazy. But when you read it, people really, really responded to it positively because you read it and you go, well, this is just how this world is. This is how things happen here. There's nothing like calling attention to the fact that this wacky, zany thing is happening. It's just, this is what happens. And then it continues on from there. There's a consistent internal logic in it, and that's been said in a couple reviews. And I like to think too that that's the same thing I tried to do with Jurassichrist, with the way heaven and the various afterlives and things work. Ideally, you don't question it in the context of the story. It might make you question things in the context of our reality, but in the story, that's just how things are.
Is there anything in the works? I'm not necessarily ready to move on from Jurassichrist. It just came out. But is there anything in the works that looks to be the next thing coming in your publishing career?
I'm not sure right now. I guess everything is kind of loaded in right now for Jurassichrist. The main thing I'm working on right now, I can't say too much about it because it's not been picked up. It's not even done enough to send to anybody. But I'm working on a collection of stories that are all connected in a really weird, esoteric kind of way through the concept or exploring the concept of alchemy, like the old, this chemical becomes this chemical, these elements come. So all I can say right now is I think it's going to be really cool. It's going to be very metaphysical. It might be up your listeners' alley, actually, because it's got this very sacred geometry feel to it.
Right.
But it's going to be interesting, and I hope to finish that manuscript at some point this year. I have several stories still left to write, but I don't know, I'll probably pitch that around and see who's interested in taking a chance on a collection with a really weird central conceit.
Thank you for being on the show, Michael, and we appreciate it, and I look forward to talking to everybody again soon.